So isolation's not an option, huh? Uh-huh. So what will they do instead? Throw money at it. Lots and lots of money. Yeah, it might work, yeah. All right. July 23rd, 1950. You've been in a fight against heavy odds, and you've taken big casualties. The enemy outguns and outnumbers you and pushes you back time and time again. What could possibly make it worse? Well, what if you lose your commanding general? I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the U.S. 24th Division was again badly mauled by the KPA, the North Korean military forces. The ROK, the South Korean forces, or the ROKA, Army, were also being pressured, but it was more of a prelude to new action. It is this month, July 1950, when U.S. President Harry Truman begins implementing the provisions of NSC 68. What is that, you ask? It is a report from the U.S. State Department's planning staff, a top secret one, completed back on April 7th. Its authors argued that one of the most pressing threats confronting the United States was the hostile design of the Soviet Union. The authors concluded that the Soviet threat would soon be greatly augmented by the addition of more weapons, including nuclear weapons, to the Soviet arsenal. They argued that the best course of action was to respond in kind with a massive buildup of the U.S. military and its weaponry. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson asked the policy planning staff under Paul Nitze to do a review of national security strategy. This was a response to the twin shocks in 1949 of the communist victory in China and the Soviet Union detonating an atomic bomb. World War II left the US and the Soviets far ahead of the rest of the world as great powers. And Nitze and company thinks the Soviet Union wants to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world. They concluded that conflict, violent or non-violent, with the Soviets is now endemic and outlined several possible courses of action. These include a return to isolation, having a full-on war, continuing efforts at diplomacy, or that massive military buildup. The authors of NSC 68 rejected a renewal of U.S. isolationism, fearing that this would lead to the Soviet domination of Eurasia and leave the United States marooned on the Western Hemisphere, cut off from the Allies and the resources it needed to fend off further Soviet encroachments. The report also ruled out a preventive strike against the Soviet Union because its authors reckoned that such action would not destroy the Soviet military's offensive capacities and would instead invite retaliatory strikes that would devastate Western Europe. NSC 68 did not rule out the prospect of negotiating with the Soviet Union. However, such an approach would only succeed if the United States could create political and economic conditions in the free world sufficient to deter the Soviet Union from pursuing a military solution to the Cold War rivalry. The actual report concludes that the only realistic way to deter the Soviets is a massive buildup of conventional and nuclear weapons. To pay for all of that extra military spending, they'd have to raise taxes while lowering other government expenditures. There's a lot of opposition initially, including from Secretary of Defense Louis Johnson and a couple of former ambassadors to Moscow. They contend that the U.S. already has a substantial military advantage over the USSR and can control Soviet expansion politically and economically. That opposition is blown away, first by ever louder charges that the Truman administration is soft on communism, particularly coming from guys like Republican Senator Joe McCarthy, who rose to real national fame in February when he said he had a list of Communist Party members in the State Department. And then also by the invasion of South Korea. The Korean adventure brought immediate dividends for the Truman administration. The Republican attack temporarily lost momentum, and the president's ratings soared in the polls. The war was popular. There was little opposition when Truman began to implement the rearmament provisions of NSC 68 in July 1950. The main driver behind this at the moment, though, is not Truman nor those at the Pentagon, but Dean Acheson. Last week, he told Truman to ask Congress for money and said, if it's a question of too much or too little, go for too much, which Truman does this week on the 19th, asking for an increase in the defense budget of $10 billion. But meanwhile, the North Koreans are rolling down the Korean peninsula as the American and ROK forces retreat. The KPA has been greatly underestimated, and it's going to take a lot more manpower simply to avoid defeat. Already this month, Douglas MacArthur and U.S. Army Chief of Staff Lightning Joe Collins even discuss using an atomic bomb in Korea, perhaps as a blocking attack to cut North Korean supply lines to Manchuria, though they do not follow up on this. Anyhow, in the east, the KPA 5th Division has been pressing forwards against Yeongdeok, where one of the few lateral roads comes out of the mountains to meet the coastal road. This is a major point to defend. At the end of last week, the Yeongdeok situation was grave as the 23rd Regiment of the ROK 3rd Division broke north of the town and were pushed back. By this week on the 17th, they are pushed south of the town, and the KPA 5th Division occupies it. They're pushed out to the north already the 18th, though, by airstrikes, heavy artillery, and naval gunfire. But already the 19th reoccupy it. On the 21st, a second battle for the town begins. This is bloody, close-quarters fighting, again backed by the distant big guns, and the ROK retake the town during the day, but are again driven out once night falls. All the villages in the area are basically rubble by this time. However, though the KPA holds Yeongdeok for the rest of the week, they are hit hard day and night by the naval guns and artillery, taking casualties that mount to the thousands by today. And the 22nd ROK Regiment has arrived from Daegu to bolster the 3rd Division. So perhaps the initiative might shift here soon. Also, from a North Korean POW, they learn of a plan by the KPA to blow both the ends of the railway tunnel between Busan and Daegu, which would sabotage logistics for the ROK and Americans. So ROK troops have been sent to protect it. The big news in the field this week, though, is the fall of Taejon. The North Korean 3rd and 4th Divisions set their sights on it as last week ended. 3rd coming from the northwest and 4th from west of them to either join them in a frontal attack or swing round and flank the city from the south. U.S. 24th Division Commander William Dean is worried the North Korean 2nd Division will also join the attack from the east, and he has to plan for that. But the ROK forces hurt them so badly last week, they aren't able to make it here, though it turns out they're not actually needed. If past practice signified anything for the future, the North Koreans would advance against Taejon frontally with a force strong enough to pin down the defenders and attack first with tanks in an effort to demoralize the defenders. Thus far, tanks had led every advance and nothing had been able to stop them. While this frontal action developed, strong flanking forces would be moved to the rear to cut off the main escape routes. This North Korean maneuver had been standard in every major action. In any deployment of his forces against the North Koreans in front of Taejon, General Dean faced the fact that he had only remnants of 3 defeated regiments. Each of them could muster little more than a battalion of troops. In addition to their numerical weakness, all the troops were tired, and their morale was not the best. Not the best is a real understatement. Dean has the divisional artillery consolidated into a composite battalion at the airstrip just northwest of the city. 34th Infantry Regiment is like 5 kilometers north and west of Taejon, holding the whole line. Of his 3 regiments, Dean had planned for the 19th Infantry to hold the northern part of the line, but it is no longer combat effective after last week. So 34th has it all. 21st Infantry is around Okcheong. Dean has no plans to do more than another delaying action to slow the enemy until he can get the reinforcements needed to turn the tide, and does plan to evacuate the city the 19th. But 8th Army Commander Walton Walker says Dean needs to hold Taejon longer so the 1st Cavalry Division, who've just arrived in Korea, can deploy into positions. Taejon is a pretty big city with like 130,000 people, so maybe Dean can do this. He orders it to hold for another 24 hours. 21st Regiment is to stay where it is and keep the road from Taejon to Okcheong open. On the 19th, the attacks begin. There are airstrikes by both sides, and then KPA 4th Division in 2 thrusts hits the city about 10 a.m. Loaded. Dean is personally directing the city defense, but the enemy artillery is withering, especially against the airstrip. Dean says this evening that he never saw as much incoming artillery fire in one day in Europe in World War II as this day. Darkness falls and Taejon holds, though by 10 p.m., enemy armor can be heard heading around the city, and the enemy seems to be infiltrating the 2-kilometer gap between 34th Infantry and what's left of 19th. It turns out the KPA is setting up a powerful roadblock on the Gumsan Road, though Dean does not know this yet. Day 2 begins before dawn as KPA T-34 tanks enter the city and disrupt the defenses. Communications are breaking down. Battalions outside the city are cut off entirely. A phosphorus rocket set off in the city center ignites one building, which ignites others, and soon much of the city is on fire. Dean calls for withdrawal towards Okchon to go off that evening. He spends the afternoon personally hunting enemy tanks, visibly doing so to inspire the men, with a team using a 3.5-inch bazooka rocket launcher. The KPA invades the city in force and swarms in and around it. Here's some personal recollections of Sergeant First Class Joseph Zito, Company H, 2nd Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment, from Michael Hickey's The Korean War, about the crazy situation in Taejon during the fight that day. He looked out of the window to see a T-34 clanking down the street, spraying the buildings with machine gun fire. In hot pursuit came General Dean and his faithful, if breathless, anti-tank squad. He saw Zito gaze in fascination out the window. "Which way did it go?" Dean shouted, and then vanished from view, still running. Zito, keen to find out what was happening, made his way down the street to the 24th Division command post. Here, he found an unreal atmosphere of calm. Visitors, including pressmen, were still being shown an optimistically marked battle map with assurances that all was well and that there was no cause for alarm. Coffee was being served. Barely 100 yards away, a T-34 had been stationary and unchallenged in an alley for some hours, displaying no identification marks. It was assumed to be friendly. Few members of 24th Division had ever received instruction in tank recognition. The tank's crew were lounging outside it smoking, and one actually borrowed 10 gallons of fuel from a passing American officer before starting up and driving away. By late afternoon, the streets are clogged with vehicles, mainly trucks, trying to form convoys to leave town. Zito is in the rear of a column that gets moving around 7 p.m. It takes heavy enemy fire from the hordes of KPA infantry entering the town and splits into 2 columns, heading down parallel streets. And when the 2 columns catch sight of each other, they open fire on each other. One column ends up in a schoolyard where it turns into a sort of demolition derby traffic jam until the artillery major who has led them there tells everyone to get out of there. So he and 120 men do, leaving all their trucks intact for the enemy. Zito's column is blocked by the giant enemy roadblock and ends up in a mortar duel with the enemy, which catches a bunch of the convoy trucks on fire. So at 8:45, the whole convoy is ordered to be set ablaze. And it is. And everyone tries to get the hell out of Dodge. Zito makes it out of town to safety with the masses of fleeing ROK and American troops. I should point out, the 24th Division Commander Major General William Dean does not make it out of town to safety. He literally heads for the hills. He will be captured by the KPA after wandering the hills for about a month. The 24th Division has this day lost its commander, its headquarters, and its supply dumps, and with them, all the food and ammunition stored there. A positive side note for the Americans, though. U.S. soldiers destroyed 10 T-34 tanks in Taejon this day, 8 of them with the new 3.5-inch rocket launcher, which is used in combat for the first time ever today. Air power destroys a bunch more tanks, but it's very interesting that the forces of the South finally have a ground weapon that can destroy the tanks of the North. The rocket launcher has been under development for a while now, but was not issued because the ammunition was not standardized until last month on June 10th. On July 3rd, Supreme Commander Douglas MacArthur requested that they be airlifted in, and they arrived in Taejon the 12th. These are like 120 centimeters long, and they weigh only like 7 kilos, and they're made of aluminum. They are electrically operated and fire a 60-centimeter rocket which has the great destructive feature of having a shaped charge that can burn through the armor of any tank the enemy has. Back to Taejon. It is hard to give you a lot of detail from this day. The sequence and the times of their occurrence in Taejon on the afternoon of the 20th of July have been impossible to establish with certainty in all instances. Participants and survivors have different recollections of the same event and of the time it occurred. Battalion and regimental records were all lost during the day and the night. Thing is, while this is going on, 21st Regiment is in its defense positions like 6 kilometers away, totally undisturbed, though it would have taken them several hours to join the fight had they been asked. They withdraw on the 21st, about 30 kilometers, to positions northwest of Yeongdong. But you have to remember this about the fight for Taejon. Just 4,000 men of the U.S. 24th Division have taken on 2 whole North Korean divisions with T-34 tanks, and they've knocked out like 20 tanks. But the complete breakdown of every type of communication has to be the single greatest factor in the overwhelming defeat of 24th Division this day, when many units took 50 or even 60% casualties. On the 22nd, they turn over frontline positions at Yeongdong to 1st Cavalry Division, who arrived the 18th at Pohangdong. U.S. 25th Division arrived in Korea last week between the 10th and 15th. There is action between 25th Division troops and the enemy this week at Yecheon on the 20th. This is the 3rd Battalion of the 24th Infantry Regiment from 25th Division. This regiment is quite interesting. They are a relic of the U.S. Army's old segregation policy, which ended in 1948 by executive order. So they're an all-black regiment. Washington wants to integrate the regiments. Well, Chief of Staff Joe Collins sure does, which will only make them all stronger. But there isn't time for that in Korea in July 1950. They withdraw or are driven out of town that night, and the next day set it ablaze with mortars and artillery. When entered, it is found to be empty of the enemy, so it's turned over to the ROK Capital Division, who will try to hold off the KPA 8th Division advancing upon it. U.S. 1st Cavalry Division is given the task of blocking the enemy and keeping open the Taejon-Daegu corridor. Walton Walker tells 1st Cavalry Division Commander Hobart Gay, "Protect Yeongdong. Remember, there are no friendly troops behind you. You must keep your own back door open. You can live without food, but you cannot last long without ammunition. And unless the Yeongdong-Daegu road is kept open, you will soon be without ammunition." U.S. 8th Army strength as of today is 39,000 men. Also, 4 National Guard divisions in the States are activated on the 20th, and the Defense Department says it requires 50,000 conscripts in September, 50,000 more in October, and 70,000 in November. But you know, the long retreat raised political problems. It was feared in Washington that if the U.S. was left to face the burden of the war alone and was humiliated, the American people would question the value of alliances. The concern led to pressure on the UN allies to deploy forces to Korea. Although Britain, Canada, and Australia had contributed naval contingents, and Australia also had an air squadron serving with MacArthur, this was considered insufficient by the Americans. The U.S. was still bearing the brunt of the ground fighting. When the Canadians argued that their 3 warships were more than a token, one U.S. official sourly remarked, "Okay, 3 tokens." This attitude was resented, but it could not be ignored. I talked a bit last week about the British situation and the differences of opinion between their chiefs of staff and their government. But in general, the low defense budgets in those nations the past few years leaves them unable to cover all the risks. Like if they deploy force they have in Korea, they'll be unable to counter a Soviet thrust in, say, the Middle East or in Europe. Washington does have a trump card, though. They are now making clear that American material or financial help with defense or rearmament depends on actually giving physical support to the Americans in Korea. Last week on the 14th, UN Secretary General Trygve Lie asked for offers of ground support. And this week on the 20th, Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley directly asks the British to send in a brigade for a counteroffensive. We will likely see their answer in a day or 2. The British are also worried about the spread of communism. At this period in Britain, as well as in America, there was intense fear in government circles, bordering upon paranoia about communist penetration of national institutions. As the Korean crisis escalated, the British government was fearful that communist-led dockers would sabotage troop and munitions movement, and reacted nervously to evidence of minor incidents at the ports. Attlee addressed the British people about the need to stand alongside the Americans in the Far East. The fire that has been started in distant Korea may burn down your own house. But in a recruiting speech, he made direct references to dangers of treachery at home. I would ask you all to be on your guard against the enemy within. There are those who would stop at nothing to injure our economy and our defense. And with Clement Attlee's words of warning, I will end this week. A week of disaster yet again for the Americans as they lose a major military prize along with their field commander. The ROK is also being hit pretty hard, but there are now 2 more U.S. divisions in South Korea ready to join what's left of 24th for the fight. And they finally have a ground weapon that can destroy KPA armor. So there are reasons for them to be more optimistic. And Harry Truman is embarking on a massive American military expansion project. In 17 days of combat, 24th Division has taken 30% casualties, and over 2,400 men are missing in action. North Korean 3rd and 4th Divisions have driven them back 160 kilometers, and they've lost enough gear to equip another division. They've also lost their commanding general. They have, though, held the motorized enemy to under 10 kilometers of gains a day in their series of delaying actions, despite having several enormous disadvantages, with lack of communications and lack of ammunition being maybe the biggest two. Not enough telephone wire, old radio batteries that were lucky to last an hour, maps from the 1920s. Here's a quote from Roy Appelman to end today. There were many heroic actions by American soldiers of the 24th Division in those first weeks in Korea, but there were also many uncomplimentary and unsoldierly ones. Leadership among the officers had to be exceptional to get the men to fight, and several gave their lives in this effort. Others failed to meet the standard expected of American officers. There is no reason to suppose that any of the other 3 occupation divisions in Japan would have done better in Korea than did the U.S. 24th Division in July 1950. When committed to action, they showed the same weaknesses. A basic fact is that the occupation divisions were not trained, equipped, or ready for battle. The great majority of the enlisted men were young and not really interested in being soldiers. The recruiting posters that had induced most of these men to enter the army mentioned all conceivable advantages and promised many good things, but never suggested that the principal business of an army is to fight. Well, that may be true for conventional armies, but the principal business of the Time Ghost Army is giving us the support we need to make our productions. All of them. They all exist thanks to the Time Ghost Army. You can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com to be part of all of this. These are the newest commissioned Army officers, and Stephen A. Claytor is the Army Member of the Week for this channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.